Well, I was going to share when I was cleaning the new Chenrezig resident library, because there's still some construction dust floating around, is I came upon this book called Bodhisattva of Compassion by John Blofeld. So I was going to share some of where, Kuan Yin, since we have 4 of them that have moved to the Abbey here, their statue forms are in the Chenrezig Hall. I was going to share some things about her, but there are so many references to Tara in here that I decided I was going to change my view. So there's a lot of theories about why around the 10th or 11th century, even though the Buddha of Compassion, Chenrezig Avalokiteshvara from Nalanda University into Tibet and Mongolia and Nepal, always had this male form, but without any, excuse me, we're going to change things. The Chinese Chan tradition, the Kuan Yin started showing up in this female form. And there are a lot of theories about why that happened, and they're all quite subtle. But one of them is that the beautiful qualities of Tara have somehow gotten assimilated into this Buddha of Compassion. So the whole book has got stories of how they sort of merge and interface. And John Blofeld was a remarkable man. He was an Englishman who was born in, I forget where in England, back in the early 1913, I think. And the first time that he ever saw a Buddha statue, he procured it, and even without thinking, made 3 prostrations and did flower offerings to it. And he had never seen a Buddha statue. So he figured out that somewhere along the line he had been a Buddhist. He fell in love with China, spent all of his life as a Chinese scholar, teaching in Beijing, teaching all over China. He taught in Hong Kong, Thailand. So he spent most of his life, he married a woman from China, and a very deep spiritual Buddhist practitioner. So part of his journey is as later on in his life, somewhere after the Tibetans escaped from Tibet and went into India, he started meeting some of the Nyingma lamas, and so he started practicing also some Tibetan Buddhism. And in one of the towns where one of the Tibetan Buddhist monasteries in India is, Kalimpong, he met a Tibetan there, and he was trying to share that there are qualities of Tara that the Chinese really love that are aspects of Kuan Yin. There's kind of humorous and very down-to-earth and very demure. And because Tara is the Buddha of enlightening activities, there's this idea, just her whole posture of just trying to get off of her seat to help us, is that there are many stories and legends in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition about how she intervenes when humans just get too much into trouble. And so he was in Kalimpong and he met a Tibetan. And today I'm going to tell a story about Tara. And whether it's metaphorical, apparently this man who's telling the story, this Tibetan, knew this person, Jigme. And whether it's a legend or whether it's metaphorical, the story is so lovely because it really shares an aspect of the Buddha's qualities where they will never give up on us. They have an incredible sense of humor, and that their bodhicitta is so vast that, just to feel the experience of the man in this story. So I'm going to read this story today because we're going into the Tara retreat on Monday. We're doing a 2-week retreat on Green Tara. And I thought it would be really apropos to sort of introduce her more humorous, lighthearted qualities on how she helps benefit us crazy sentient beings. So here's the story. It's only about, it's not even 3 pages long. Okay, so John Blofeld was saying that he wanted to share some of her more humor, and he says, I've had this story from a Tibetan, and I will try to tell it as he did. So near our village in Tibet, there stood an isolated cottage where lived an old fellow named Jigme. As a boy, I would see him going up the path behind our monastery in all kinds of weather, taking provisions to the cave of our local hermit. His end, when it came, was sudden. 2 days of ailing, and he was gone with a smile. Since long before I came into the world, he had been renowned as an eccentric, forever singing songs to Tara, making offerings to Tara, meditating on Tara, always, always Tara. We boys used to make fun of him among ourselves, for he reminded us of an elderly husband making a terrible fuss of a teenage wife for fear she might run off with someone else. Our elders thought the world of him, and the monks gave him a splendid send-off, banging away at their drums and chanting for good 3 days before taking his whole old body up to the mountain as his final offering to the birds and beasts, who probably didn't mind it being a bit tough. When we had gotten used to his being gone, we put him out of mind most of the time, but we shall never forget the stories told about him on the night before they took away his body. When young Jigme had been noted for 3 things: strength, good looks, and a blazingly hot temper. As a petty trader, he had dealings with the monastery. He once got into a scrap with the layman who worked as a cook there. They'd been drinking in the monastery kitchen, only Chang probably, but that can be strong enough. Without quite knowing how, Jigme managed to kill the man and ran off, leaving his body sprawled across the kitchen flagstones. The authorities took as lenient a view as they could, and Jigme was sentenced to be locked up in the monastery dungeon for a time. From the moment the door clanged behind him, he started yelling like a madman and battering the wood with his fist, though his shackles rang like cymbals clashing. Just after nightfall, when it was too early for Jigme to think of sleep, and a sudden silence fell, and presently one of the monks went down to see if the wretched man had injured himself. No one who knew Jigme could imagine him just giving up. On his way to the cell, the monk stopped short, having caught the sound of voices. First came Jigme's voice, saying fiercely, "Yes, yes, all my life, I promise." The answering voice brought the old monk in the passage to his knees, forehead to the ground. In tones gently mocking and yet of inconceivable sweetness, someone replied, "Then see to it, Jigme dear. Otherwise you might be held to it in ways you would find uncomfortable." Who could doubt that those sweetly mocking tones were holy Taurus? Not daring to intrude, the old monk tremblingly padded off in search of the abbot. The next morning, Jigme was not to be found in his cell. The door and window seemed much as usual, but the shackles lying on his bed had been wrenched asunder like bits of dough cake. They found him later sitting dazed and peaceful in his own cottage. Well, there was no question of dragging him back and making him serve his sentence after that. Who would dare? Yet there was plenty of excitement. The villagers kept peeping through his window in hope that Tara would appear again. She did not, but she had earned Jigme such fame that they made him chief contractor to the monastery, and in doing very well indeed, he gradually began to lose his new air of peacefulness. Now and then business took him to a nearby township, not more than 3 days' ride from our village, if you had a good horse like Jigme's. Once, while putting up at an inn, he got into a fist fight with a couple of men from Durgay. Felling one with his great fist, he was about to assault the other one when a raggedly dressed girl came running in from no one quite knew where, crying, "Jigme dear, for shame! That's the way to mildew good barley." Then she was gone. But Jigme, trembling like someone troubled by a ghost, dropped to his hands and let the second man from Durgay give him mighty trouncing that left him unconscious on the floor. That was not the end of it either. A consignment of barley he had bought for making chang for the monastery festival, due in a few days, turned out to be so damaged by a mysterious dampness that the abbey ordered him to take it away and to get his money back. A year or so later, Jigme was defrauded in some way by a cloth merchant. Finding everyone agreed that he was in the right, he decided to press charges that were likely to cost the fellow more than he possessed. Some people thought him too ruthless towards the poor wretch, with a family to support, so they tried to get him to withdraw or moderate the charges. Not Jigme. Off he rode with his manservant to the district magistrate's seat, a place on the border of Kham where the authorities are Chinese. In the outskirts of the town, finding the way blocked by a clumsy carter, he raised his whip. Before the blow could fall, a young girl darted from the crowd saying, "Take care of your horse doesn't tire of carrying such an oaf." By then the way was clear, and Jigme pressed on at a fast as a trot as the width of the street allowed. All of a sudden, a length of cloth hanging up in a dyer's yard billowed out in the wind. The horse shied, and Jigme fell on his head heavily enough to crack his skull. By the time he had recovered from the accident, the cloth merchant had fled with his family to another neighborhood. Nothing more was heard of the lawsuit. After that, all went well for several years until Jigme took it into his head to ride off with his man on a pilgrimage to Kumbum Monastery. At a wayside inn, he fell into quarreling yet with some ruffians and drew his sword. They ran off only to waylay him further along the road with a dozen or so mounted supporters. In the fight that followed, 3 of them were wounded before Jigme and his servant were secured. Maybe they had meant only to rob him and give him a good beating, but their blood was up and they decided to make an end of him. While preparations were going forward to have a little fun with the 2 captives, an elegant young man with pink cheeks and maiden soft skin came galloping up leading 2 spare horses on a rein. "Jigme, my dear, you are duller than a yak," cried a well-known voice. "Be sure this is the very last time." With these words, the youth drew a deep breath and, blowing it out effortlessly, caused the dust to ride in clouds. Yellow night engulfed the earth until long after the captives had ridden off to a place of safety. The Jigme who had left for that pilgrimage was not the same as the Jigme who returned. From Kumbum he brought back a precious statue of Tara made of alloy mixed with gold, and many pretty things for furnishing a shrine room in her honor. Gradually relinquishing his trading ventures, he spent more and more time at home and soon turned into the pious recluse we knew in my boyhood. I suppose no one ever learnt of the whole affair, but nobody doubts that Tara was involved at every stage. I would like to know why she favored this ill-tempered young fellow more than any of the pious folk in our village. At some time in his childhood or soon after, he must have won her heart by some great deed of compassion which has never been recorded. I wish I knew how to do the same. So she's never going to give up on us, no matter how stupid, foolish, ill-tempered, habituated we are to our afflictive states of mind. And the Tibetan tradition is filled with stories. Sometimes you're not, you don't know what the punchline is, but sometimes it's very, very clear. And whether this is just a legend or not, it doesn't matter. This is the enlightening activity of someone like Tara, who will go to extreme measures to help benefit sentient beings, no matter how ill-tempered, no matter how obstinate and stubborn they are. So may we, as we head into our Green Tara retreat, be able to create the causes and conditions to have a very wonderful relationship with her now and in future lives until we become Taras ourselves. So, to John Blofeld, thank you for the story.